Welcome, and thank you for joining us for Reparative Archival Description, the Past, Present, and Future panel event. I'm Ann Rhodes, and I will be hosting this event along with Monica Lehman, Emma Metcalf-Hurst, and Allison Clemens from Yale University's Reparative Archival Description Working Group at the Yale University Library. We'll hear from our speakers today about their work with reparative archival description in university and community archives contexts, followed by an open panel discussion and Q&A session. First, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement and then go over our agenda, our norms, and then read our panelists' bios. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Powgashit, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples, have stewarded for generations the lands and waterways of what is now commonly known as the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples, nations, and this land. Now, the agenda for our event, the panelists will each share a short presentation of their work. Next, we will have a moderated discussion moderated by RAD member Allison Clemens, and we'll end with an open Q&A session. Our event norms, a reminder to please be respectful in this space. Please hold your questions until the Q&A session and add them to the built-in Q&A function in Zoom, which we will open up at that point. We'll moderate the chat as well, but we encourage discussion only in the chat rather than questions. We'll also do our best to prioritize answering questions that have been asked multiple times. Closed captioning has been turned on as well. You can click Show Captions at the bottom of your Zoom window. And finally, the event will be recorded and made available to the Beinecke Library's YouTube channel in the coming weeks. Now I will introduce our panelists. First, we have Alexis Antricoli. She, her is the director of the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan. She's a member of the Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia's Anti-Racist Description Working Group and contributed to the Anti-Racist Description Resources Project. Her current professional interests are community-based stewardship practices and increasingly the practice of leadership that supports transparent, participatory, and inclusive organizations. Jackie Dean, she, her, is the head of archival processing and co-head of special collections and technical services at the University of North Carolina Libraries, where she manages staff engaged in reparative archival description. She was a member of UNC Libraries' Conscious Editing Steering Committee from 2019 to 2021. Krista McCracken, they, them, is an award-winning public historian and archivist. They work as a researcher-curator at Algoma University's Shingwauk Residential Schools Center in Bowading, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Métis people. Krista's research focuses on community archives, residential schools, decolonization, access, and outreach. Jessica Tai, she, her, is the archivist for faculty papers and institutional records at the Bancroft Library. Prior to her role at UC Berkeley, Jessica was an archivist at Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where she chaired the library's Reparative Archival Description Working Group from 2019 to 2022. And finally, Allison Clemens, she, they, is access strategist for special collections at Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, Yale University. Allison has been a member of Yale's Reparative Archival Description Working Group since its founding. She also serves on Yale Library's Responsible Metadata Operations Framework Implementation Task Force and Yale University's Cultural Heritage Bias Awareness and Responsibility Committee. So now I will turn it over to our first speaker, Alexis Antricoli.
Thank you. I want to just start by thanking Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia to present at this event, and I'm pleased to be doing so on behalf of my colleagues. So I'm going to give an overview today of how the resources came to be and what's happened since they were published, and what I expect will be some of the future of reparative description. So to begin, the origins of the resources were at SAA in Portland in 2017. At that time, Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia, or A for BLIP, as we call it for short, was very new and had really only put out a single statement. And we were matched that year with Teresa Rayford of Don't Shoot Portland at the Liberatory Archives part of the conference to talk about some of the work that we were doing and in conversation with Teresa. And one of the things she brought up when we met with her before that presentation was that in her research, her own research, she had come across a lot of racist terms in the libraries and archives she was visiting. And she asked, are there any resources or guidelines or standards for archivists who are doing this work so that they are not continuing to perpetuate this language? And we said, no, there really isn't. So when we all got back to the Philadelphia area, we started work on this, and you can move to the next slide. And so we started, I just put out a call on our A for BLIP email list, and we got a lot of people who were interested, and we just started by researching what was in existence, what had been published, what were people doing at other institutions, and gathered all this information and created abstracts of what was out there. And over time, there was a lot of attrition until we ended up with a core committee for the anti-racist description resources consisting of Valencia Johnson, Annalise Berdini, Faith Charlton, Katie Rodden, Kelly Bolding, Amanda Ferrara, and myself. And we basically took the research from there and we wrote the resources in basically a first draft. And then what we did is, because we are mostly a group of white women, although not exclusively, we invited outside reviewers, including Teresa, to look at the resources and to provide us feedback on them. And then we took those the feedback from the Black archivists who reviewed the resources, and we made revisions to that first draft and did all the editing and proofreading we needed to do to design the resources as they currently exist, to publish them, and then to get the word out that they were available. And that was mostly through professional listservs and presentations that we did in various capacities. So the next slide talks a little bit about the original publication happened in 2019. It was a PDF. We did a minor revision in 2020 to that PDF, at which point we realized that if we were going to do revisions in the future, we were going to need an easier way to do that. And so in 2021, we put the resources on GitHub where they can be more easily managed. And then the next step after, you can go to the next slide. This is, we did in late 2021, early 2022, we did a survey about how people were actually using the resources. And we sent this out again to professional listservs mostly. And the responses we got were mostly from academic libraries, so 76%. We did have some respondents from museums, public libraries, government, and historical societies, and some who didn't fit into any of those categories. But this was useful to us in seeing actually how the resources were being used. Although I think we would get different answers to some questions today, which I'll talk about in a bit. Next slide. And one of the things we asked was, how have you used or incorporated the resources into your work? And a lot of it was, you see over here, updating local descriptive practices and guidelines was a really significant part of that. Another significant part of how people were using it was in retrospective work, so doing that legacy redescription. There was also, it was used somewhat in instruction, just in reading and discussion, collecting public statements and disclaimers, but the two places it was really used the most were actually in doing, just doing this kind of reparative description. Next slide. And then we also asked, is there a section or sections you found particularly useful? And it was really the parts that were most useful to people were around how to handle folder titles and creator supplied description that archivists typically wouldn't change, how to audit legacy description, voice and style, and then some other, you'll see some other things here that also came up but were 50% or lower, including some of the information in the bibliography and some of the information on community collaboration and subjects and classification. Next slide. And then in 2022, SAA endorsed this as an external standard. We went through the process through the description section. One of our members, Faith Charlton, shepherded the process, and they are now linked from the SAA website. This is not something we set out to do, but it's something that, as we saw that people were using these quite extensively, and that they were useful, and that it may be useful to update them over time. This seemed like a good idea. So they're now officially endorsed SAA external standard with links from the SAA website. Next. So what does the future look like? And I think there are two things that the future of reparative description could potentially look like. And one is a really great and positive development, which is, I think, collaborating with communities outside of library staff on this work. And I know that this is already happening in many places, but it wasn't in 2017 when we started in the way that it is now. People weren't talking about it in the same way, which of course doesn't mean that it wasn't happening. So this is one. And then the next slide, I think the other one is a challenging direction, which is that as we see anti-DEI activism and the focus on universities, at this moment, I think we're likely to start getting more pushback to the work that we're doing. And I know at my previous institution that is starting to happen. And there was even, while I was still there, I had an experience where a faculty member pushed back on some of the work that we were doing. So I think we are going to see more of this, and the challenge is going to be figuring out how to continue to do this work and how to navigate the challenging politics of this moment within our institutions. And so I will wrap up there. I think I stayed mostly within my time, and thank you again.
Hi, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm Jackie Dean, and I wanted to just give a little bit of background and context for our work at UNC. Go to the next slide. So you've heard from us at UNC before, my Special Collections Tech Services colleague, Eileen DeWittia, presented to RAD in 2021 and gave a big picture view of building the infrastructure for ethical description in our UNC libraries. She also spoke about the support we get for doing this work from library leadership and from our colleagues. And as Eileen is saying here, in 2017, Special Collections Technical Services staff started to work on revising legacy description and writing new descriptions with a focus on inclusion. The next slide. And so we called our work Conscious Editing in reference to the Conscious Style Guide, a website that collects style guides and articles covering terminology for marginalized communities. And in 2019, our Associate University Librarian for Special Collections, Maria Estorino, is now our University Librarian, charged a steering committee of staff from across the library to guide our work. Next slide. And the steering committee was instrumental in building an engaged library-wide culture for ethical description efforts and allowed us to incorporate more voices into this work. And during their 3-year tenure, the committee hosted discussions about descriptive language. They charged a task team to specifically draft remediation recommendations. And of course, in 2022, they produced the Guide to Conscious Editing at UNC. So UNC Library has been actively collecting manuscript and archival collections for nearly 100 years. And to date, we have 6,208 finding aids. So there is a lot of legacy in our legacy finding aids. I'm gonna go to the next slide. For the past 2 years, we've been focusing our proactive remediation efforts on the approximately 700 legacy finding aids for antebellum collections from the Southern Historical Collection, which is the oldest manuscript collecting unit in Wilson Special Collections. Many of these collections were acquired in the 1930s by a white curator and history professor from his network of influential white Southern families. And many families were enslavers, and the collections often contain information about the people they enslaved. A growing number of researchers are using these collections to find information about their enslaved ancestors and trace their family histories. And the finding aids for these collections exhibit many failures of care, to use Burgess Jewell's accurate and meaningful phrase, for the enslaved people whose lives were recorded in the documents. The finding aids were written for researchers studying slavery as an institution rather than those looking for people in the records, and the language used does not acknowledge the humanity of enslaved people. So we wanted to enact the recommendation from A for Blip, anti-racist resources, to describe records in a way that supports the need of stakeholder communities, not just academic scholars. And so we're sharing a link of the revised finding aid. This is a relatively new revision, and the legacy version. And so we can go to the next slide. So we wanted to learn how to meet the needs of researchers using the manuscript collections to trace their family history. And in 2022, inspired by the recommendations in Jessica Tye's essay, Cultural Humility as a Framework for Anti-Oppressive Archival Description, we designed a project to interview 10 experts in Black family history research. And we were supported in this work by an internal grant program in UNC Libraries for Equity and Inclusion work, which enabled us to compensate interviewees for their time with us. We compiled a report about the project available at the link, and you can hear my colleague Nancy Kaiser and one of the interview participants, Nika Sewell-Smith, in the recorded presentation from the 2023 SAA Research Forum. So like Alexis was saying, proactively connecting to users in this way, that was a significant shift for us. We did reflect, respond, implement on user feedback when it came to us. But after doing these interviews, we felt equipped to engage directly and embed this practice in our work. And next slide. So our next engagement effort was connecting with site managers at Historic Stagville, Vera Soselsky and Khadija McNair. Historic Stagville is a state historic site in Durham, near us, that once was the largest one of the largest plantations in North Carolina. And so the plantation records, called the Cameron Family Papers, are housed at Wilson Library, where they're one of our most used archival collections. Vera and Khadija worked closely with the descendant community at Stagville, and they generously gave us input on how the Cameron Family Papers finding aid could be more helpful. We published a revision that incorporated their feedback in August 2023. So at this point, we've remediated around 60 finding aids with slavery era records. We plan to continue that work. And looking ahead, we're doing another round of user interviews, this time focusing on how we can best contextualize the body of antebellum finding aids for users. And we will, of course, share about this work soon. So this is another slide. This is the staff of the archival processing section. I've said we several times. This is the we, and we welcome feedback, suggestions, concerns about any of the remediation work that we're doing. There's a lot to talk about. We have a lot to figure out still and learn. Earlier, I mentioned Nika Sewell-Smith, the genealogist. In her interview with us, she encouraged all of us working on descriptions of sources about enslaved people to come together, because if we're working in silos, we can't see and portray the enormity of slavery. So if you're doing this work too, we would love to talk, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So next slide has my citations. So, thanks.
Thanks so much. And so I'm up next. I'm Krista McCracken, and I'm going to be speaking about some of the description work that's been happening at the Shingwauk Residential School Center. Before we get started, so I am Canadian. I'm also a settler. And the work that I'm doing today and speaking about today really represents decades of work undertaken by residential school survivors. And it's really their work that I want to honor. And I feel tremendously grateful that I've been able to spend like the last 15 years of my career working alongside the Shingwauk survivor community specifically. Before we dive in, I do also want to acknowledge that I'm going to be talking about residential schools and showing a couple of images connected to residential schools. And so full acknowledgement that this is a challenging, emotional topic. Please take care of yourself and take the space you need. And if that means you need to step away from the computer, I am not going to be offended. Please do that. Can I get the next slide? So I'm going to start off by chatting a little bit about the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association and the survivors of the Shingwauk Residential School. So the Shingwauk Residential School closed in 1970. And in 1981, they held the first Shingwauk reunion. And very much this was organized as a school reunion designed for people who went to the school to come back and begin to talk about their experiences. But if we're thinking about climate, like in 1980s, residential schools are still open in Canada at that point. There's also not a national conversation happening about residential schools. So the fact that this grassroots group came together in Sault Ste. Marie in the 1980s is really significant. But a couple of different things also happened at that initial gathering in the 1980s, particularly people showing up saying, I want my history recorded. I want that on audio. I want that on video. I want my experiences in an archive. Maybe they didn't use the word archive. That's just me. And beyond that, also a few people showed up with like a single document or a handful of photographs and said, I want to be able to share this information. How can I do that? And that's actually how the grassroots archive that became the Shingwauk Residential School Center was started. And so it's a little bit of a different way into the archival mindset. And right from the very beginning, the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association have been collecting material and describing it based on their needs, which is very different than like an academic archive. Can I get the next slide? That being said, there are still definite colonial legacies within the archive, particularly because a lot of the records are dealing with residential schools and were created by the people who operated those schools. So one of the longest running programs offered by the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association is the Remember the Children project, which focuses on connecting survivors and communities to residential school photographs, but it also works to redescribe those photos. This project started as a pilot in 2004, focused on residential schools that were located in Spanish Ontario. And it was working with a collection of about 5,000 images and working with community to identify who was in those photographs, primarily because most of those images didn't have any context, they didn't have any names associated with them. And at the end of the project, there was actually a close to 40% identification rate in the images. And I know, like at a surface level, the act of adding names may seem small, but it can actually be really huge. It can have a profound impact on individuals, families, and communities, particularly when those photographs might be the only photos that are connected to that family from their time in residential schools and representing that harm that was done in those schools. Got the next slide. That project, the Remember the Children project, has continued since the early 2000s. We still take books of photos into community, or folks come in and say, hey, I heard you have photos, can I take a look at them? But beyond that, some of the other ways that we've been engaging with community has been around trying to share images in a digital format. And the image on this screen is an example of one that initially had no names associated with it. And it's a photo of the judo club that was at the Moose Factory Residential School in Northern Ontario. And all of the names that are listed there really came from online engagement with survivors and intergenerational survivors. And beyond just the names, the stories that came out about the judo club itself and the ways that girls actually interacted with the judo club, that we had no idea that that was a thing, like just that rich historical information that came from having those conversations and centering community, I think kind of points to how relationships are very much at the core of some of this description work. And can I get the next slide? And so I think one of the things that I've often been thinking through is how archival description and the redescription of difficult histories really needs to be community-centered. And that means this work is going to take a lot of time. It's not me sitting in the office redescribing every single photo. I think that would actually cause more harm than potentially working with community and working to figure out, you know, what is the appropriate language to be used for this? And what does it look like to make that accessible or not accessible based on the language and also the priorities of the community? So I'm going to leave it there, but really looking forward to a rich conversation today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Tai, and I'm grateful to be here today representing RAD, where I chaired from 2019 to 2022 until I went to my current role here at UC Berkeley. Next slide, please. So the Reparative Archival Description Task Force, also known as RAD, was formed by Yale University's Archival and Manuscript Description Committee, MDECO, in 2019, and was later recharged as a working group. Reparative description was being undertaken at Yale, but was being done in an ad hoc way. And therefore, RAD's charge was to explore how to address harmful language in our description in a more thoughtful and systematic way, and to make reparative description more transparent and coordinated among the libraries at Yale. At the time that we formed in 2019, although reparative description was surely a burgeoning topic, there wasn't as robust of a discourse around practices and case studies that we see today. Certainly there were people engaged in reparative description that RAD drew inspiration from, namely the anti-racist description resources by Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia, and harmful language statements and reparative description work being done at Temple, UNC, and Princeton University libraries. So after RAD formed, we saw this kind of sharp rise in interest in reparative description, in large part due to the increase in DEI-focused work within libraries following the 2020 call for a racial reckoning, and paired with the pandemic, which allowed many archivists the ability to devote remote work time to auditing harmful language in archival description. Next slide. So when RAD formed, we decided to conduct a pilot project on archival description related to Japanese American incarceration to test out workflows and develop documentation. I won't have time to get into the details of the project today, but if you're interested in hearing more, RAD hosted a symposium on the pilot project, and the recording of that is available online. But ultimately, our pilot project gave us a strong foundation from which we developed guiding principles and workflows for conducting reparative description work in the library. It also reinforced the challenges of developing new reparative description workflows in the specific institutional context of Yale, which is a large and complex library system. So considering the theme of today's panel, I wanted to think back to our approach 5 years ago and reflect on how or if we would have done things differently if the task force was charged today. Next slide. So one thing that our group did relatively early on that I believe was valuable and would recommend for others to do as a first step was to develop guiding principles. As we began getting into the work itself, we realized the challenges of bridging the gap between theory and practice. So RAD's guiding principles really served and allowed the group a theoretical foundation upon which to develop our collective vision and to help guide our decision making. Next slide. Another invaluable component of our pilot project that we built in from the beginning was to actively involve community consultations to help determine and guide our work. We met with the representatives from the community groups Densho and the Japanese American Citizens League to discuss draft project plans and preferred terminology guides. And Yale was able to provide an honoraria to compensate our community partners for their time. We also benefited from expertise located within our campus community, including library staff and a faculty member and student with subject expertise. And it's helpful to note that community consultation can look different depending on your institutional context. Your institution may not have a built-in community of subject experts or funds to pay honoraria for community groups, but there are still many ways to build community-centered reparative description practices. That could be through consulting existing reparative description documentation, modeling your work after other projects, or even meeting with archivists who've done projects that you'd like to implement at your own institution. I know personally on RAD, we did a lot of calls with folks. These are all valid methods of community consultation. Next slide. Looking back, I'm also able to see how the group would have benefited from establishing more concrete scoping guidelines early on. We were often asked what type of description was included in our work. Did we revise description for archival collections and manuscripts, or did we also remediate bibliographic description and subject headings? We got these questions very frequently, and I felt because of that, there was a bit of a scope creep that occurred because we weren't able to definitively say what we did and did not work on. And we did eventually create and publish guidelines around the scope of RAD's work, with the caveat that exceptions and differing circumstances were likely to come up and might still merit work on a case-by-case basis. But we have those guidelines on the LibGuide under the feedback and inquiries section. Next slide. So looking towards the future of reparative description, there are a few areas that I'm excited about and hope will be explored further. The first is a focus on developing models to allow user feedback to drive reparative archival description work. This has been an area of interest that has been growing within the reparative description community, most notably with the recent creation of the user experience section in SAA. And this interest grows from the lack of data on the impact of reparative description efforts and the desire to take a more responsive and user-centered approach to reparative description initiatives. I also think that in addition to traditional models of user testing, there are a lot of opportunities for creative approaches to gather user feedback. I'm personally interested in exploring the idea of reparative description hackathons or other community-centered events that focus on gathering feedback from users as well as potential user communities that can really focus on those who may be represented in our collections, but whose depictions in archival records have historically been subjected to harmful descriptive practices. And the second area of focus that I'm excited about is assessment. Stephanie Luke and Sharon Mazzotta have created a maturity model for reparative description, which is a shared tool to assist institutions in evaluating reparative description work, measure progress, and plan areas of strategic growth. And this is an incredibly valuable and needed tool, and I'm looking forward to seeing how folks implement the model and how it can help foster cross-institutional shared practices. And lastly, I am interested in scalability and developing profession-wide communities of reparative archival practice. Scalability of reparative description workflows is really needed, especially for smaller, less resourced institutions. However, the challenge is that scalability and the distinct needs of differing institutional contexts can often be at odds with each other. So I hope that as we move forward, that there are more robust communities of practice to support reparative archiving, centering many of the aligning principles of reparative description included in RAD's guiding principles, including cultural humility, dismantling white supremacy, and transparency. And I see this as a really integral aspect in thinking about scalability because it provides this common set of core values and ethics to begin from, no matter what your starting point looks like. So even when institutions vary greatly in technical infrastructure, or they differ in organizational and cultural contexts, or are at very different stages in developing a reparative archiving practice, we can kind of come back to a foundation of reparative archiving built on shared values and nurtured through our communities of practice. And with that, I'll hand it over to Allison. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And hello, everyone. My name is Allison Clemens, and I'm the Access Strategist for Special Collections at Yale. I'm going to speak briefly about RAD's work for the last few years. And I want to thank Jessica for setting our working group up for success through her exemplary leadership. Her vision and insight continue to guide RAD's work in the present and into the future. Also, I want to begin by saying that our work at Yale in the past, present, and into the future is informed, as Jessica said, by our own context. I want to acknowledge that information workers across the US and the world are working in highly variable contexts. And as Alexis also mentioned, some of those contexts are actively hostile to work that can be labeled as DEI work. So my thoughts are with those workers as I talk through this work at Yale. Next slide, please. So RAD's recent focuses have been in a few areas: in responding to institutional changes as Yale Library undergoes a special collections reorganization, in working on reparative description focused projects, and in building a community of practice at Yale for reparative description. And today I'll talk specifically about RAD's recent projects. Next slide, please. So I'll start by talking briefly about a few projects that RAD has recently completed, although of course this work more broadly is never done. I'm speaking on behalf of RAD today, but of course all of the group has contributed to these projects, and thank you to my colleagues for their leadership and labor. First, we revised archival description pertaining to suicide to align with current terminological best practices. Second, we recently updated our contextualized instances of a descriptor slur in archival description and in library headings. This is a slur against Indigenous women, and the U.S. Department of the Interior renamed geographic place names using the slur in the fall of 2022. We updated those place names in our systems and also reviewed and removed or contextualized the use of the slur more broadly in our archival description. And finally, we've also recently responded to user feedback about how the Richard Henry Pratt papers were previously described. Pratt founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, widely considered the first Native American boarding school in the United States. These schools removed Native American children from their homes and forced them to assimilate into white American society under the guise of providing education. Carlisle created the template for similar state and religious institutions in the US, and so RAD members redescribed the Pratt papers to more appropriately and accurately contextualize Pratt and Carlisle and to emphasize the broad and harmful impact of these boarding schools. And if folks are interested in learning about those last two projects, the RAD blog provides a summary of both of them. Next slide, please. So a little bit now about RAD's ongoing projects. We continue to provide support for our Yale Library colleagues on reparative description work. That's ongoing and regular work for us. A RAD subgroup is currently determining an approach for materials at Yale pertaining to Native American boarding schools beyond just the Pratt papers. That was sparked by the Pratt Redescription Project, and as part of that specific redescription effort, we made a commitment to at least reviewing other collections pertaining to boarding schools. And so that project is now in the planning stage. And another RAD subgroup is building local best practices for recording or updating gender identity information in our archival description. And then another RAD subgroup is working on updating archival description for collections consulted during research for the university's Yale and Slavery project. And finally, the group continues to focus on outreach and engagement efforts like this one. So thank you all so much for being here. Next slide, please. And then I'll close my brief remarks about RAD's recent work by noting related work at Yale Library and Yale outside of RAD. So first, Yale Library recently implemented new guidelines for reviewing and providing online access to sensitive material. These guidelines provide criteria and a workflow for assessing requests to remove or modify potentially sensitive or distressing content or description in our discovery and digital access systems. The guidelines also provide criteria to guide the selection and review of material for digitization and online access. Second, Yale Library recently created its Responsible Metadata Operations Framework Implementation Task Force. That task force is doing preliminary work needed to implement a framework for responsible metadata operations at the library beyond, but including archival description. So that'll really let us try to coordinate responsible metadata work across the entire library and eliminating, I hope, some of the scoping issues that Jessica mentioned in her presentation. And finally, the university's Bias Awareness and Responsibility Committee continues to serve as a venue for staff at the libraries, galleries, and museums across Yale to connect with and learn from one another regarding key issues. Next slide, please. So I've put up my contact information in case that's helpful to anyone to learn more about any of these projects. And with that, we will move into the moderated discussion followed by an open Q&A. So thank you all so much for your presentations. I really enjoyed hearing about all of them. I have a few questions that I would like to ask, and some of you addressed these already and some of you haven't yet done so. But I would really be interested in starting maybe with what's something that you have learned or words of advice that you would want to pass on to others who are just starting out with reparative or inclusive description work. Jessica, I really appreciated you sharing some about that in your presentation. I don't know if other folks, or if you have anything to add too, but if other folks have thoughts about, with the benefit of hindsight, what you might recommend to folks who are just getting started in this work.
I think for me, one of the things that comes to mind is how long this work is going to take, and recognizing that it's okay just to bite off small chunks at a time. And so creating that plan for recognizing that this is going to have to be ongoing work, and also recognizing how much advocacy might be necessary to get it built into part of your regular job might be required.
Thank you, Krista. Yeah, completely agreed. Thank you for highlighting that. Other thoughts from folks?
Yeah, I appreciated what Jessica was saying about community consultations. It took us a while to kind of get to the first interview, and we had a pretty steep learning curve back working in tech services. And so I think you know, if we could be helpful, but also I think you know starting and reaching out and keeping that going so we could get there. Now I'm wishing we had maybe reached out a little bit more.
I think the other thing that comes to my mind is the fact that, yes, you have to start from scratch for your collections, but that doesn't mean theoretically you have to start from scratch. Like there are lots of models out there. And so I think like turning to all the links that are in the chat for today and other resources of other institutions who are starting to do this work or who have been engaged in this work for many years can help kind of alleviate some of that initial stress around how do I even begin to tackle this?
I mean, I think that I would say that, like Krista said, that it's just a lot. There's a lot to do. Is that I think the work is just never going to be done. There's never going to be a point where we're going to say we finished it because the world changes and we don't know if things that we're doing today, are going to need to be revisited by our successors. And so I think just finding a place to start, if you know you have one collection that has really problematic description, start there. And once you start doing it, I think it then gets easier to see that even if you're only doing a small thing, or that you're still making some kind of a difference in the aggregate, even if you're never able to get to it all. And I really just don't think we will in our lifetimes.
Yeah, Allison, I appreciated in your presentation how you had quotations around the completed projects, because I think that really captures the spirit of iteration needed in this work. And I think some of that is also kind of resetting our expectations around what a completed project looks like and knowing that it is a continual process. And another thing that I would also add is from the beginning, reaching out across your institution, whether that be to public services or curators or other folks in the library who may have, depending on your positionality, may have more interaction with users, because I think pulling in those folks is really informative and also helpful for them to know what you are working on, what your vision is.
Thank you all for those responses. It's really, they're all thought-provoking. And I wonder, Krista, you said something about advocacy a few moments ago, and I wonder if maybe we could talk a little bit about strategies that folks have found there in terms of like internal advocacy efforts, maybe with, sort of your management layers or library administration, and maybe strategies and success stories that you've had in terms of advocating for staff time or resources to do this kind of work.
I know I'm in a very different context than a lot of folks, but for working with and prioritizing Indigenous reparative archival description, particularly in Canada, like pointing to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and the reconciliation framework that was endorsed by our Canadian archival community have been really helpful tools to point management to, saying like we actually have a professional responsibility to do this, and it's been endorsed by our professional organization.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we've had sort of we've used similar strategies here at Yale. Like as we're thinking about the boarding school project, there's a report from the Department of the Interior that talks about the importance of the work like we're planning now for that project, that it's been really helpful, I think, to point to as, demonstrating urgency for it. Are there other folks? I didn't mean to put Krista on the spot. I don't know if other folks have thoughts about internal advocacy efforts and strategies.
So this is maybe a little bit off center of that, but I think one of the issues and shifts in doing this work for us has been, coming out of almost a decade of hidden collections, unhiding, setting up workflows so we can iterate and not add to the backlog. So really, just all of us shifting to incorporate this kind of more close analysis of collection material and the time that goes into setting up interviews and doing them and meeting with stakeholders and that kind of thing. That was a new way of working for us. But I feel like we haven't had to really do a lot of advocacy because this work has been prioritized. But we do, on a day-to-day basis, have to kind of manage. I think like all of us, a lot of stuff coming in the repository and taking care of it and the stuff that's already here. And also carve out this time. And so I think I've been so appreciative of just the wider professional context. Maybe things that aren't pieces that aren't even directly speaking about remediation are supporting it. Like we just a few of us were in a 3-day kind of wonderful meeting set up by TS DAX to talk about describing archives, a content standard. In our standard principles is built in, working for users and working strategically and doing iterative work. So I have found all that very helpful in trying to shift the work of our section, and also operational impact, all the discussions that have been out around that, and not overwhelming repositories and tools for thoughtful collecting. And also the presentation, the discussion around archival debt, and how we take on new work when it means not doing other stuff, and what the ramifications are, and how hard that is. And I thought that presentation at 2020 SAA and the article after was just so helpful with all this.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for that really thorough and thoughtful response. I wonder, sort of moving from thinking about internal advocacy to thinking about, networks of support. And Jessica mentioned this in her presentation in terms of building broader communities of practice. But I wonder if you all have thoughts about how we can better support each other in doing reparative description work, especially in different cultural and geographic contexts.
So for me, I think support has been really crucial in terms of just working in a archive that deals with a traumatic history and a traumatic present, to be frank, like colonialism. And the capacity to be able to say, I'm having an emotional reaction to how this was described or to what I'm looking at, and to have colleagues that you're able to turn to say, I don't even know how this was labeled this. Like, and to be able to have those sounding boards, I think is really important. And I think recognizing that, having that community for work can also help alleviate some of the load. So it's not you as one individual responsible for all description.
maybe touched on this a little bit, but just to kind of reiterate that the acknowledging of positionality and especially institutional positionality is always very helpful, because it's easy to listen to presentations like this and just compare the work that you're doing and feeling, it's already feels like a really high barrier to access to just even begin reparative description work. So I think when you can kind of forefronting your institutional positionality and having the recognition that, for folks at institutions that are already understaffed have, increasingly higher workloads, that we can always support each other by reiterating that reparative description work looks different at different institutions, and that's okay.
Alexis, I wonder if you have thoughts about sort of how that has looked in the Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia context, because that's obviously an organization that is sort of building a local community of practice beyond just one institution, right? Yeah, I wonder if that group has had conversations about sort of it as a network of support for this kind of work, and like what that's been like, if there are things that you think have been successful in building that as a community of practice, or things you might, do differently into the future.
I mean, I think that that's been, in some ways, was important for the success of the project, is that there were people who were invested in it and wanted to talk about it. I think that the events that the community has that bring people together, not just to talk about this topic, but even to talk about community archives projects or advocacy on other issues, it helps build connections, right, with people at other institutions who are in really different contexts. And those connections then mean that you have people that you can reach out to who are interested in this work, to share, like, well, we came across this problem, what are you doing? So we never really did anything formal like that, I would say, but I think we did a lot that created sort of more informal networks of people who felt comfortable talking to each other about what they were doing, how they were doing it, what was working, what wasn't working, whether or not they were getting any pushback. I mean, I never, until the past couple of years, I never heard anyone talk about pushback they've gotten for this work, but I'm hearing about more of it. And it may just be that the work is more visible now, that we're talking about it more. So I think it's good to have colleagues who can share how they navigate those situations with each other.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that probably is related to like the anti-DEI activism that you mentioned earlier. Like, I think there's probably, some undercurrent of that before, and it's getting, sort of bigger and bigger in terms of profile. So yeah, thank you for mentioning that in your presentation. I wonder, Anne, should we move to the open Q&A portion? I could ask another question, but we've got just 1 minute left of the moderated discussion. So we could launch the open Q&A if that sounds good to you.
Sure, I was just gonna give you a minute heads up. So if you're fine to go ahead with the Q&A, I think that would be great. Everyone, we're gonna open up the Q&A feature now. So we'll be taking questions in there, not in the chat.
Yeah, and while folks sort of put their questions into the Q&A feature, I can start off with, we did log a couple of the questions that came into the chat. And I'm really interested in this question that we got for Krista, which is, can you speak to the ethics of photo identification? Are identified descriptions available online? If there are people who've been identified who are not present during the identification process, do you reach out to them before adding their names? Have you had people asked to take their names off of photographs? etc. So that's a question for you, but also if any other panelists have done photo identification, of course, please weigh in as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'd say when the initial photo identification project started back in the early 2000s, it actually wasn't connected to the archival record in any way, shape, or form. It was more about providing community with access to these photos. And so the names are recorded and kept in the photo, reproduction photo albums that were being created, but never linked back to the archival record. And so that has since happened. And yes, the names are available online now, but we do have a policy that if anybody wants the names removed, it's an automatic takedown on our part. I've worked there 14-ish years, and I think we've had one. That being said, a lot of the identification is done by family members, and it's someone identifying a relative quite often. There are certain types of photos that we don't share online or in community, and that's guided by survivors and intergenerational survivors. Basically, the Children of Shengwak Alumni Association are the ones who make those decisions. But their decision around the names was that it is important to honor who attended these schools. And so that's why the decision was made to put that online.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's really helpful for me, and I hope for the person who asked the question too. Other thoughts about photo identification? No one else mentioned it specifically, so if not, we can go on to the next question. I would be curious to hear people's thoughts about reaching out to BIPOC communities with the goal of not causing harm, given the fact that our field is made up of mostly white archivists and archival workers, and that people serving on reparative description groups, therefore, are probably also predominantly white in most settings, at least. So I wonder if anyone would be willing to speak to that. I might, Alexis, if you don't mind, I might put you on the spot to just sort of talk a little bit more about the consultative work that you did for the review group for the resources.
Sure. I mean, so what we essentially did, I'm going to actually talk about that, but I'm going to talk about also the Reconnect Recollect project here at the University of Michigan. So for the consultative work we did for the resources, we essentially reached out to people that members of that committee knew in the field who would be able to provide that feedback, and we set up mechanisms for them to both comment directly, identifiably on the draft, as well as to submit anonymous comments. We also paid them for their time and said, don't spend work. This is how much we can pay you. We don't expect you to spend any more than this amount of time on this work. If you think you need more time to do this, let us know. So it was both making sure they were compensated appropriately for their work, providing them various mechanisms for feedback, and taking that feedback really seriously and using it to make changes in the resources. Since coming here to the University of Michigan, I've also been involved in the Reconnect Recollect project, which is a project to connect indigenous communities in the Philippines with records that are held here at the university. The University of Michigan has one of the largest collections of Philippines materials, both archival and object collections in the world. Because so many faculty and alums were involved in the American colonization of the Philippines. And a lot of these collections document indigenous communities. And we have 2 faculty members, a Filipino faculty member and a Filipino-American faculty member, who are leading this project. That's a collaboration with various collecting units across campus to build connections with the source communities in the Philippines. So we traveled last year to the Philippines, and we brought copies, both physical and digital, of these materials to institutions there. that were close to communities and had connections with the communities. And we really just had conversations with communities about what they needed, right? We just mostly listened. And also we were present. That's the other, as we took the time to go. And we took the time to listen. And we're going back again this summer to visit some other communities. And I'm really committed to for the Bentley to continue to be a part of this project. And thanks to Joyce, who just put in the chat the link to RCRC, and which is led by Ricky Punzalan and Deirdre De La Cruz. So Ricky is an archives professor, and Deirdre is a history professor. And so that is, like, both of those, the core part of it to me is you have to go into it with a listening spirit and understanding that you're not the expert and you're the learner and you're just there to listen, and you might have ideas, but your ideas are not really the important ideas. That's how I've approached it in the situations I've been in.
Thank you so much, Alexis, and I'll pause in case other panelists want to respond to this question as well.
I'll just echo that. When we were kind of starting out planning the interviews, I think we're going to have, questions and very, like we spend a lot of time coming up with questions but in the end, what we really wanted to lead with is just whatever we had questions to guide if needed, but we just wanted to hear what genealogical researchers' needs are, what feedback they had for us, anything they wanted to tell us. And I think really the idea where we shifted was not like we're getting a data set of information that we're going to analyze, but more just we're meeting people and learning from them and hopefully developing relationships where we can go back and forth. And so that was the shift, one of the shifts we had.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask the next question. And Jessica, you talked a little bit about thinking about scale and resources, but there are a few comments in the chat from folks, sort of emphasizing the fact that many archival workers are not in resources that are in institutions that are well resourced. And so there's a question about whether folks had any examples that they would like to share of reparative description work taking place in less well resourced organizations.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. There's basically a staff of 2 in our archive. So like some of this work is shoestring. We're using an Excel spreadsheet for most of it. Like it is possible at a smaller institution, but I think part of it is we also don't have much of a backlog. So we are able to dedicate a lot of time to more community-oriented projects. It also aligns really closely with our archives mandate, so it makes a lot of sense in that way. But resource-wise, we are not swimming with people or money, for that matter.
Any other thought? Thank you so much, Krista. Any other thoughts or examples that folks would like to share? I'm remembering Alexis's comment of sort of like starting where you are and starting with one thing, right? I think that's helpful to like bring that down to scale too. Okay, so if there are no other comments about that one, I have a lot of these questions have been pretty big picture. So I'm gonna ask a very practical question that someone asked and at least one person upvoted, which was, for those of you updating legacy finding aids, how are you tracking and sharing the changes made? Are those details public? Are old versions of finding aids retained?
Can answer that. At least at Yale for RAD, we retained versions of all redescription that we did, either through, we had an automated system for capturing versions of finding aids. So those were available through a GitHub repository. And then for the revisions we made to catalog records, that was a little more tricky because there was not any automated system for capturing previous versions of catalog records. So we actually created a manual process for saving versions of MARC records, which is actually the process for that is available on the RAD page. And we also created standard notes to put into finding aids and catalog records to indicate that previous versions of finding aids or catalog records were available. So we're always trying to be transparent and acknowledging when that work was being done and let researchers know that they could access those previous versions. This kind of connects to what I was talking about previously in terms of, I would be really interested to see if those records, those previous versions of records are being requested and what people, would be interested in doing with that information. So a further inquiry.
Yeah, we are also doing the GitHub repository, but it's we're trying to make available the TypeScript sort of 1930s, very very original iterations of the finding aids just as PDFs linked to the updated finding aid. And from what we've heard from researchers is they really do want to see those and as much information as possible.
Thank you, Jessica and Jackie. I would just also say, I don't think you said this, Jessica, because I was tracking in the link, so I may have missed it. But I think for us, it was also really valuable, again, to have those guiding principles in place because we knew that transparency was really important to us. And so as we were thinking through decision-making about versioning and making, previous versions publicly available, that was at the front of our minds, is that like transparency was a core guiding principle and commitment for us. And so I think that that's like one specific example of why it's helpful to have those in place as you get started on the work, because you can turn back to them as you're thinking about sort of very practical decisions that you have to make. Other thoughts on versioning, or even just sort of like openly sharing, past description work and how you've managed that in your organizations? We've got just 1 minute left, so I'm hesitating to ask another question, but I see that there's a shout out in the chat to Krista's book, Decolonial Archival Futures. I'm going to second that shout out because I have also been reading it and it's really extraordinary. So thank you so much, Krista, for your work on that publication. I would recommend it to everyone. So thank you to the person who mentioned that. And thank you so much to everyone on this panel for your really thoughtful conversation and contributions. I've learned a lot this afternoon and I really appreciate all of your time and expertise.